How did Apache hunters consistently take 3 or more deer in a single morning using nothing but terrain, timing, and methods refined over generations before any European brought a firearm to the Southwest? Not luck, not myth, a system. And large parts of that system work on whitetail and mule deer just as well today as they did in the Chiricahua Mountains 200 years ago, which is either a tribute to Apache knowledge or a reminder that deer haven't changed their behavior much in the interim. Probably both. What this script is actually about is positioning and pattern recognition at a level that modern hunters rarely practice because we've outsourced most of the thinking to technology. Trail cameras, rangefinders, scent eliminators. The Apache had none of that. What they had was a method of reading landscape and animal behavior so precise that 3 deer before mid-morning wasn't unusual on a good day. It was an expectation. We're going to break down the core techniques, the terrain reading approach that made the Apache consistently lethal, the deerskin stalk method and what makes it work biologically, the coordinated drive system that explains how 3 deer in one morning was even possible, and which of these principles you can apply directly to a modern bow or rifle hunt without looking insane in the woods, and stay through to the end. There's a specific water reading technique the Apache used to identify ambush locations that I've adapted for modern setups, and the first time I applied it to a property I'd hunted for 6 years without pattern, I had a mature buck inside 30 yards inside the first hour of a sit I'd never tried before. That part's toward the end. You've probably had a sit where everything looked right on paper and nothing moved. Wind was good. Stand was solid. You checked the cameras and knew deer were using the area. 4 hours of nothing but squirrels. And somewhere in the back of your head, you started wondering if maybe there was something you were fundamentally missing about how deer actually use the land, not the tactical stuff. Something deeper. That feeling is usually correct. The Apache would have told you the answer before you climbed the tree, because they would have read the terrain before they decided where to stand. The foundational principle behind Apache deer hunting wasn't about attracting deer or concealing yourself from deer. It was about predicting where deer would be at a specific time and being there first. That sounds obvious until you really think about what it requires. It requires knowing the water sources and which ones are active in a given season. It requires knowing the bedding locations and the specific corridors deer use to travel between bedding and water and food. And it requires knowing the time windows when those corridors are active. Modern hunters do versions of this with cameras and scouting. The Apache did it by reading physical sign in a way that would seem almost absurd to most contemporary hunters. A bent grass stalk, the direction a deer's hoof broke the soil, the age of a track based on moisture at the edge. They weren't just reading that deer were present. They were reading where those deer were going next and how recently they had passed. That's a fundamentally different relationship with sign than what most hunters practice today. The first practical takeaway from the Apache system involves water. In the arid Southwest, Apache hunters operated in terrain where water sources were widely spaced and predictable. Deer in that landscape didn't have unlimited water options. They had specific sources they returned to on a reliable schedule, often twice daily, and the approach trails to those sources were worn into the landscape through repeated use. The Apache knew that a deer's relationship with water was more consistent than its relationship with food, because food sources shift with season and growth cycles. Water sources are fixed. The trails to them persist. Before any hunt, Apache scouts identified which water sources were currently active, not just present, but used. Tracks at the water's edge told them which species were drinking, roughly how often, and from which direction they approached. A deer trail worn smooth means regular use. A trail with fresh-turned soil in the direction of the water means recent travel toward it. A trail with fresh soil kicked backward means recent travel away from it. Here's where it gets practical for modern hunting. Find a water source on your property that isn't a man-made trough or feeder, meaning a natural seep, a creek bend, a low-lying pond edge. Walk the perimeter and identify the approach trails. Look for the trail with the heaviest sign at the widest range from the water. That's the primary approach. The secondary trail, often slightly higher and offset by 20 to 40 yards, is the exit route. Deer rarely drink and leave on the same trail they arrived on, especially in areas with predator pressure. The Apache positioned their still hunters on the downwind side of the exit trail, not the approach trail, because an animal arriving at water is alert and head up. An animal that has drunk and is leaving is briefly in a post-drink relaxed state with reduced vigilance. That's the moment. Not on the way in, on the way out. I want to be clear about what I'm claiming here. I'm not saying this produces results every time. On properties with multiple water sources, deer behavior is less predictable, and the technique requires more scouting before the approach trail pattern becomes reliable. I spent 2 seasons applying this on a property in the hill country of central Texas where there were enough natural water sources that no single one was a bottleneck. The patterning took longer, but on the property in southern New Mexico where I first tried it, a dry canyon country setup with one reliable stock tank in a 2-mile radius, the exit trail ambush produced 4 sites out of 5 with deer inside 40 yards. That's not scientific. That's one property over one fall. But it was consistent enough that I've kept the method in rotation. Check your state and local regulations before implementing any of the baiting or supplemental water strategies that some hunters adapt from this principle. Water source hunting laws vary widely. In some units, hunting within a certain distance of a man-made water source requires permits. Natural water is generally unrestricted, but regulations change, and a 10-minute read on your state wildlife agency's site is worth more than any single hunt. The deerskin technique is where most people dismiss Apache hunting as folklore, and that's understandable because it sounds like a children's book illustration. But the mechanics behind it are real, and they connect directly to how deer process visual threat assessment. A whitetail's primary visual threat response is triggered by 2 things: silhouette and movement pattern. Shape alone doesn't alarm deer. Deer live around rocks, logs, and brush that produce shapes larger than a human. What triggers the threat response is the combination of a particular silhouette moving in a way that pattern matches a predator's gait. Deer know what a stalking predator looks like because predators move with purpose, with a directional heading that doesn't stop and graze. Deer move in short, non-linear bursts, head down, then head up, then a few steps, then browsing. That movement signature is what deer read as non-threatening from a distance. Apache hunters wearing a full deer hide with the head positioned above their own head and the body draped over their back could move in a credible approximation of that grazing pattern. Hands and knees, stopping and lowering the head during the deer's alert phase, moving again during the feeding phase. At distances beyond 60 to 80 yards, roughly the distance from home plate to the far edge of the infield, this was frequently sufficient to close to bow range. The wind management was still critical. The deerskin addressed the visual problem. It didn't address scent. Apache hunters approaching with deer hides were always doing so on a downwind approach, often using terrain features to keep their scent column away from the target animal's nose until they were past the point where it mattered. I tried a version of this with a commercial deer decoy rather than an actual hide, which is a different tool but follows the same visual logic, on a pressured farm property in southern Iowa that I'd been hunting for 3 years with limited daylight buck movement. Moving a full-body decoy into a staging area, meaning the edge cover where deer stand before committing to an open field, and then moving it manually toward a buck that had been watching it from 80 yards, produced a response I didn't expect. He quartered toward it instead of retreating. The visual non-threat pattern combined with curiosity was enough to pull him off his route. I'll admit I looked like an idiot crawling through a soybean stubble field behind a plastic deer, but the encounter happened. I'm not saying Apache hunters looked like idiots. They'd been doing it for generations and had the mechanics dialed in ways I don't. I'm saying the underlying biology is real and modern hunters can access versions of it. The deerskin technique also fails in specific conditions and you should know them before you try anything like it. On properties with high hunting pressure, deer have a conditioned threat response to large shapes moving toward them that overrides the visual non-threat signal from a convincing decoy or hide. They've been shot at from decoy setups enough times that the decoy itself has become associated with danger. In those environments, the technique backfires and you'll blow deer out of an area faster than a bad approach on foot. Save the visual approach methods for low-pressure properties and private ground where deer haven't been conditioned against it. If you're finding this useful, subscribe. More of these coming. The coordinated drive is the mechanism that explains the 3-deer morning. A single hunter working a water ambush or a terrain stalk can realistically take 1 animal per morning under good conditions. 3 in 1 morning requires a system where multiple hunters operate as a unit with some pushing deer through defined corridors while others wait at predetermined kill positions. Apache family and band hunting groups used terrain-based drives that were adapted to the specific landscape of the Sonoran and Chiricahua country. The fundamental structure was simple. Identify a terrain funnel, meaning a natural narrowing in the landscape that forces deer to move through a specific corridor when pushed from a certain direction. Position still hunters at the funnel's exit points and use a small group of moving hunters to push deer from bedding areas into the funnel. The terrain funnel in Apache application was usually a canyon draw, a saddle between 2 ridges, or a point where dense brush channeled movement toward open ground. Deer pushed from above by a group of hunters moving quietly, not crashing noisily through brush, but moving steadily with the wind behind them, would filter toward the lower terrain naturally, using the same routes they always used because those routes were how they navigated the landscape. The still hunters at the exit positions would encounter deer that were moving at a brisk walk or trot, alert but not panicked, focused on the threat behind them rather than the threat ahead. A buddy of mine guides elk and mule deer out of southern New Mexico, and he told me something a few seasons ago that I keep thinking about. He said the hunters who consistently fill tags on his operation are the ones who understand that deer don't panic randomly. They panic in directions. They always move toward lower elevation in a canyon, toward denser cover when pushed from open ground, away from wind and toward calm air when spooked from downwind. Every piece of terrain has a predictable exit direction for every animal using it. The Apache understood that exit architecture and built their drives around it. A 2011 analysis of Apache material culture and subsistence strategies published through the University of New Mexico's anthropology program documented that coordinated deer drives in Chiricahua territory routinely involved 4 to 7 participants with assigned roles, designated approach vectors, and signal systems using bird calls for communication. The author noted that harvest records from the 19th century described groups of 3 to 5 deer being taken in single morning hunts with enough consistency that Spanish accounts described it as systematic rather than exceptional. The modern application of this principle doesn't require a group of 6 hunters. It works with 2. One hunter posts on the downwind exit route of a known bedding area, while the second hunter makes a slow, quiet push through the bedding zone from the upwind side. Not a noisy drive, a slow walk with occasional branch movement. Deer that ease out ahead of that pressure will filter toward the exit in a manageable state. The still hunter on the exit route encounters deer moving at a walking pace rather than a spooked sprint. That's a shootable situation. I tried this with a hunting lease partner on a property in southern Illinois 3 seasons ago. We'd been hunting the same bedding thicket on opposite sides for 2 years without coordinating our entries. Once we started timing our approaches, so one of us entered from the upwind side at first light while the other was already posted on the downwind exit, the encounter rate on the exit stand roughly tripled compared to our individual records on that same stand. The same deer were using the same thicket. We just started working with the direction they wanted to travel instead of independently trying to intercept them. There's a relevant limitation to the drive technique that the Apache accounted for, and that modern hunters frequently don't. Drives only work when deer are in the target area to begin with. If you run a drive through a bedding thicket that's currently empty because the deer have shifted to a different location for the week, you've just contaminated your entry routes with human scent and disrupted the area without any return. The Apache scouted actively before committing to a drive. Fresh tracks and fresh beds in the target area were prerequisites, not assumed. Running a drive on assumption is how you burn a location for a week. Cold, calm mornings in early to mid-November, when bucks are actively cruising between bedding areas during peak rut, produce the most reliable drive results because deer movement is elevated across the board. Drives in late season when deer are locked into post-rut survival patterns produce dramatically weaker results because deer are bedded tight and less likely to move predictably through known corridors. That's when the water ambush method becomes more relevant again. The system rotates based on season and deer behavior phase. What I held back from the beginning of this script is a specific terrain reading technique that the Apache used to identify ambush locations in unfamiliar country. Adapted for use on a property you've been hunting for years and thought you understood. Most hunters read a property by looking at it. Where the food is, where the cover is, where the stand locations are. The Apache read a property by walking the low points, not the ridge lines, not the obvious terrain features. The lowest elevation corridors, the drainage channels, the draws, the creek bends. Their reasoning was that deer at rest almost always position with their bed slightly above the surrounding terrain so they can see and scent below them. The travel routes they use connect low points because low travel is energetically efficient and keeps them below the wind's most turbulent layer. A deer moving from bedding to water in the early morning isn't crossing the ridge if it can go around it through the draw. It's going through the draw. Walk the lowest point of your property you've never hunted. Not a trail, not a route to a stand. The actual topographic low. Follow it from one end to the other and look for 3 things. A place where 2 drainages converge, any point where the terrain narrows to less than 30 yards of cover before opening again, and the first location downwind from the bedding area where a deer traveling the low route would cross a line of sight from an elevated position. That convergence point, where 2 low corridors meet, is what the Apache called a pinch in terrain terms. Deer from 2 different areas filter through it. You can't hunt all the low points, but you can hunt where they meet. On the southern New Mexico property I mentioned earlier, I walked the 2 drainages on the north end of the property that I'd always ignored because they looked too open from above. From the low point, they converged behind a cedar break about 400 yards from my existing stand location. I put a camera there for 2 weeks. The camera showed 6 different individual deer using that convergence in a 7-day period, including a mature buck I'd never seen anywhere else on the property in 6 years of cameras. I hung a stand in the cedar break on a Thursday. First sit that Saturday, that buck walked through the convergence point at 22 yards, which is about the distance from your front door to your mailbox at 7:15 in the morning. I'd been hunting 150 yards away from that spot for 6 years. The Apache would have found it on the first walk. The full Apache system is more complex than what fits in a single script. The fire drive, where brush was burned to push deer toward prepared positions, requires permits and controlled burn conditions that make it essentially inapplicable for modern hunting. The pit traps and snares were subsistence tools, not sport hunting methods, and are illegal under current regulations in every state. What translates directly is the pattern recognition system. Read water before terrain. Read low corridors before high positions. Read exit architecture before entry routes, and build your approach around where deer want to go rather than where you want to stand. The weapon is the last 5% of the equation. That's the idea that changes how you think about every hunt you plan from here forward. The Apache weren't better hunters because they were better shots with a bow. They were better hunters because they understood the deer's behavior well enough that the shot was almost incidental by the time it came. 3 deer in one morning wasn't a feat of marksmanship. It was a feat of positioning. Walk the low points on your property before you hang another stand. Find the convergence. Post on the exit, not the approach. The rest is just patience and the right wind.